Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to the fourth episode of Behind the Screen, in which I give my Dungeon Master commentary on my new D&D campaign, Hinterlands of Elandria. I'm Lex Starwalker. I'm the host of the RPG podcast Game Master's Journey, and I've started running this new campaign a few weeks ago. This is a story of my own creation in a setting of my own creation called Primordia. And I thought, in addition to live streaming the campaign so people can enjoy it, I would also produce this series of episodes behind the screens in which I talk about the campaign from the perspective of the Dungeon Master. I'm going to talk about how I've prepared and planned the campaign, how I run the campaign at the table, and discussion of how things went, what I learned, things like that. So a big topic of discussion on my podcast, Game Master's Journey, is how to improve our craft of GMing, how to become better GMs. And we've had loads of interesting and illuminating discussions on Game Master's Journey about DMing, but those are by necessity rather theoretical discussions. And it occurred to me that it would probably be much more helpful for newer GMs or any GMs wanting to improve their craft to be able to see examples and to kind of put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. So I came up with the idea for this project of running this original campaign online so that you can watch it, and also discussing it before and after the various game sessions. So that's what we're doing today. And this is the fourth of these episodes. So if you're brand new, you might want to go back to the beginning of the playlist and catch up, but that's up to you. So first off, I want to wish everyone a happy Halloween. This is October 31st, Halloween here in the United States when I'm streaming this. And this is actually normally our game night. We normally play Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Pacific time, but because of Halloween, we're not playing tonight. So I thought it would be nice for those of you that are following the campaign to do this behind the screen video instead. Now, chances are good that this is going to stand in for our monthly live stream that we do for Game Master's Journey. I would normally do that tomorrow. I do it the first Wednesday of every month at 3 p.m. But just due to the nature of what I'm trying to do with this project, I've got a lot of these videos to produce. I've already run 3 sessions of the campaign, and I'd like to, at least in the beginning of the campaign, I'd like to do at least one video on each session discussing how I prepared for the session and then how it went and all that good stuff. And I also wanted to produce some videos kind of setting the stage, which is what the first video was, telling you about the world of Primordia itself. And if I'm ever going to get caught up, I've got a lot of videos to produce, because today we're going to talk about the first session, and we've already played 3 sessions. So instead of doing yet another live stream this week on something else entirely, I'm going to spend that time focusing on producing these behind the screen videos so that we can keep up with what's going on, because I have been writing them. I've actually, let's see, this is the 4th behind the screen episode. After this one, I've got 4 more already written. I've got up through behind the screen number 8 written already. And the reason I do that is I want to write the episodes when the game session I'm talking about is still fresh in my mind. So I usually write them within a few days after the actual game session. But I'd also like to produce the videos as soon as possible so that I don't forget various things that I maybe didn't write down. So I'm trying to power through these and get caught up, at least in my production, as quickly as possible. Now, some of the videos I may have to wait a while to release because I don't want to spoil the campaign for my players or for people enjoying the campaign, but that doesn't change the fact that I still need to produce them now, or better yet, yesterday. So apologies to any of you who were looking forward to this month's live stream, but I've been doing a lot of live streaming in the last few weeks, and we'll continue to do so. So you'll have plenty of opportunities to get on here and chat with me and talk about Hinterlands of Elandria, which honestly is probably what I would have talked about on the live stream anyway. So we're killing two giant J's with one stone here, one really big stone. All right. So today we are talking about the first session of the campaign, which was called Into the Wilds. So in the last behind the screen episode, I talked about preparing for that session, and now today I'm going to talk about it again from the perspective of, okay, now I've run the session, and now let's talk about how it went compared to what I anticipated, what I planned for. This is a little weird for me because I already run the session even before I made the last episode, but hopefully it won't be weird for you. All right, so hopefully at this point you're caught up on the behind the scenes episodes, and hopefully at this point you've at least watched the first episode of the actual play Into the Wilds, because that's what we're talking about today, and I think this discussion will definitely be more useful to you if you're caught up on all that stuff. But again, that's up to you. So the first scene of Session 1 Into the Wilds, and the first scene indeed of the campaign, is a scene in Druinda's chambers. So Druinda is the NPC who is the sponsor from the guild, who has basically hired the player characters, brought them together as a group to go explore to the east of the city in the wilderness, a vision that she had of a village that's still out there surviving somehow, and she wants them to go find it and figure out how it's managed to survive. Now, for all the context of that, to understand what all that means, you can refer to the previous episodes in the series. I'm not going to go through all that yet again. So, I've talked about that extensively, why this is the way it is. So if you remember in the last behind the scenes, or behind the screen, when I was talking about beginning the campaign, I'd mentioned that I was planning on beginning in media res, which is to say in the middle of things, in an encounter or something exciting happening. I talked about, the PCs getting flying mounts that will take them to the campaign area. I talked about having an aerial encounter with a mana core on the way. And at that point in my planning, my thought was that the encounter with the mana core would be the first scene, that I would begin the first session with a brief kind of description of what's been happening, where they are, what's going on, and then jump right into the mana core encounter. Looking back, I think maybe I screwed up a little bit and probably should have done that. And the reason I was planning to do it that way is I firmly believe, just like if you're writing a book or you're producing a movie, that you want to hook your audience as quickly as possible. In this case, the audience being the players, and the best way to do that is to start out with something interesting happening, and starting out a brand new campaign with a bunch of exposition and throwing players in a role-playing scene where there's not much going on and they're expected to role-play with one another, in my experience, never ends well, or seldom does, and usually is just kind of not a great way to start a campaign. And I wanted to learn from my mistakes and instead start in media res, start with an encounter, and just get going. And I discussed that quite a bit in the last behind the screen. But in the final stages of preparing, I decided to go against that and do something different. And I decided to instead have the first scene occur in Druinda's chambers at the guild hall in the city of Elandria. And the real reason that I decided to do this, even though I normally wouldn't do this, is because it occurred to me that Druinda would bring the player characters together so that they could all meet one another, and would send them out together as a group. And I thought it might work better as far as the role playing to actually do that scene and to give the players a chance to role play the first time they meet each other, as opposed to starting later on when they're already on the road, so to speak, and that's already happened, and they have to all kind of pretend that they've had their first conversation together. Because I've started adventures in media res like this before and said, okay, you guys already met in the past, and it's often caused some confusion because, you know, that first time they meet, they kind of establish, you know, what their relationships are like at that point. And it's kind of difficult for a player to just jump in and say, okay, we've already had this initial meeting, but we really don't know how that went or what transpired. And it can be hard for all the players to be on the same page as far as how everybody feels about everybody else and what they do and don't know about one another and stuff like that. And I just thought it would be nice to give them a chance to role play. And I figured, you know, if they don't bite, if they don't really role play, I can just move on. And so that's what I ended up doing. And I'll talk a bit about why I think now maybe that was the mistake or a mistake. So I decided the first scene would be they're summoned to Dorinda's chambers. They're told to come ready for a journey, to bring all their gear and everything else. And she basically once again explains what they're doing and gives them some time, about a half hour or so, to kind of just socialize with one another and get to know one another. And then when they're ready, she takes them up to the roof of the guild hall where their flying mounts are ready for them to mount up and embark on their journey. All right. So that was the new plan. And unfortunately, I think that doing it this way, the beginning of the session ended up being pretty weak, in my opinion. And you can watch the actual play and let me know what you think. But it felt pretty weak to me. It felt like a slow start. It felt like we were kind of twiddling our thumbs a bit too long. Another part of it was my initial description of the city and what was going on was way too long. Which is another piece of advice I often give. You know, GMs don't start out a campaign with a bunch of exposition. And what did I do? I started out with a bunch of exposition and just thought I would get through it a lot quicker than I did. So that wasn't ideal. Now, part of the problem, if you watch the actual play, part of the problem was we were having numerous technical difficulties, which is just, it's difficult. First of all, just playing online, the various programs and technology you have to deal with. And then on top of that, live streaming it, there's just a lot of moving parts. And especially with a brand new campaign with new players, there's always going to be something that goes wrong, usually numerous things that go wrong in that first session. It didn't help that I forgot that I had not yet made an overlay for the campaign, which basically what the overlay is it's the dressing that goes over the video. Because I've got a Google Hangouts window open showing with the players. I've got, you know, various folders and things open for images and stuff. And that's what I'm looking at. But what you see as a viewer watching the actual play is an ordered scene with this overlay over it that kind of brings everything together and makes it look nice, or at least ideally it does. And because I'm doing some things differently than my last campaign, I needed to make certain changes to the overlay. And I forgot to do that, forgot I hadn't done that. And so I was kind of scrambling about while we were playing, trying to get that sorted out. And then along with the technical difficulties, it just kind of killed momentum at the beginning. It took us a while to get going. And then I was very distracted by the technology and all the stuff going on. And so I wasn't really as focused as I like to be as a GM. So all of this, I think, contributed to the beginning being a bit of a rocky start and not what I was really hoping for. So, I should have probably started in media res. I shouldn't have started with the role playing encounter. Or at the very least, I should have had Druinda be more interactive and done with more with her interacting with the players to get the role playing going. And I probably would have done more of that, but like I said, I was very distracted by trying to get everything working on my end, while hopefully the players were kind of entertaining themselves in the meantime, and so it just it didn't go as well as I would have hoped. And I mentioned in the previous installment of Behind the Screen, but when we went to the roof of the guild hall and the player characters were shown to their giant Stellar's J mounts, and the tender proceeded to show them, how the saddles worked and help strap them in and all that stuff. I made sure to hang a lantern on the fact that the player characters were well strapped into their saddles, because I knew I was going to do this aerial combat with the Manicore coming up, and I didn't want them. I wanted them to understand why falling out of the saddle wasn't, for the most part, something they needed to worry about. Because again, if they would have fallen at the height they were flying, it would have been instant death to a second level player character. So I didn't want that to happen. And again, I talked more about that in the last episode. So the second scene of this session was the encounter with the Manticore. Again, I talked a bit about this in the last episode, but I did not expect them to kill the Manticore. It wasn't my goal. My goal was not to have a drag out fight between them and this Manticore. The purpose of this encounter was just to show that traveling the wilds is not safe, and even flying and flying high on these giant birds, avoiding the lion's share of dangers that were out there, it still wasn't safe. Primordia is not safe. And the main goal of this encounter, other than just to have something interesting happen, was to get that across. However, one thing that I kind of screwed up on a little bit was I had looked at the Manicore stats and saw that it was slower than the Giant Jays, which was good in my book, because that way the player characters could get away, which was in line with what I was wanting to do with the encounter. However, I didn't really crunch the numbers to figure out, based on the different speeds and the range of the Manicore's ranged attack, how long it would likely be within range and able to make range attacks versus the players. And on the flip side, how long it would be in the player character's range and how long they would be able to make attacks with it. So what I kind of pictured happening when I planned this encounter was 1 or 2 rounds of combat in which the Manicore flung some of its tail spikes at the characters, and maybe they shot some arrows or bolts or spells at the Manicore, and then that was about it. But that's not exactly how it went down. For one thing, I'd forgotten the incredible range of a longbow, and didn't realize that my archer character took the feat, sharpshooter, I believe it's called, which removes the penalty for firing the bow at its maximum range. So he was in range with the Manicore all day. And just because of the speeds involved, the Manicore ended up being within range and them in range of it, and vice versa, longer than I anticipated. Now, luckily for me, it didn't really matter, in that I'm perfectly happy and fine with the way that the encounter played out, even though it lasted longer than I planned. Basically, if you haven't seen it, in a nutshell, what happened was the Manicore attacked with its tail spikes, and the players were flying their birds away and slowly outdistancing the Manticore. But the players continued to attack the Manticore for as long as they could, for as long as it was in range. And thanks to a few really good rolls and attacks on the player side, and especially I believe the killing blow came from Craig's character, Quincy, who is an archer with the sharpshooter feat, as I mentioned, and was able to keep firing after everyone else was out of their range. They actually ended up killing the Manicore, which I did not plan on, but was fine. Now, I also mentioned in the last episode that in addition to this one Manicore that closed within combat range and engaged the PCs, they also saw something like 6 Manicores in the distance. And it was far enough away that if they just kept going and didn't slow down, these other Manicores would never have a prayer of catching them. But if, on the other hand, they dilly-dallied or they decided to fully engage this one Manicore and kind of stay in the same area, these other Manicores could have closed within combat range and become a threat. And there's no way they could have handled 6 or 7 Manicores. And I think the players knew that. I think their characters knew that too. So that kind of served to keep them on their toes and kind of encourage them not to decide to have a slugfest with this Manicore and indeed to keep going. And that seemed to work well as designed. So as I said, I'm happy with the way the encounter played out, even though it didn't play out exactly how I anticipated. And here's a news flash for you if you're a new GM. Encounters or scenes that you plan will almost never, and maybe indeed never, play out the way that you think they might. That's just the nature of role-playing games. It's just the nature of being a GM. You gotta be able to roll with that. Things are never going to go the way you plan, but it's still good to plan because it gives you something to work with. And when you know what you're doing, preparation and planning is never wasted, which is a theme I'm sure we'll come back to again and again in these videos. Hey, Steve, welcome. And I'll let Steve know and anyone else anyone else watching, this episode should not have any spoilers for what we've done in the campaign thus far, which is why I'm live streaming it. So I was happy with the way it went. I feel like the way it played out, it let the players feel powerful. It let the characters feel powerful because they killed this Manicore. They didn't really take a whole lot of damage from it themselves. And they were victorious and things went very well for them. It gave them a chance to have some fun. It gave us a chance to kind of up the tempo of this session. It had been kind of dragging at this point. And it gave them a chance to test some of their abilities and kind of see what this character can do. I just hope they don't get too cocky because they did defeat the Manicore quite handily. But if they would have, for instance, been on the ground where the Manicore could have landed and engaged in melee, things would have gone very differently. And if any of the other Manicores would have come into the fight, things would have gone very differently. So I have pretty smart players. I'm not really concerned, but I do hope that the characters, understand that, hey, we kind of got lucky and the circumstances were really stacked in our favor. And just because we won the day-to-day doesn't mean if we encounter a Manicore sometime else in the future that it'll go equally well, because you never know what could happen. And, like I said, the Manicore was able to only bring a relatively small fraction of its total capability to bear against the players just because they were at such long range and outrunning it. So they defeat the Manicore and they continue on their way. The next scene of this adventure is when the player characters arrive at the Misty Wood. The birds land, they dismount, they get their supplies off the birds, and then the birds take off back to Elandria, and the characters are now on their own in the wilderness, in this clearing, in the woods. Now, discussing this encounter that I ran in this scene, the third scene, and the final scene of this first session, is a perfect. This is a perfect opportunity to explain how I set up and run what I'm going to call flexible encounters. And I've been wanting to coin a term. A lot of people use the term random encounter, but that's a loaded term. And at least for the way I do what some people would call random encounters, it's not really accurate because they're often not at all random. So I finally came up with the term flexible encounters, which I think is a good term in that it illustrates how I use these encounters and lets us keep track of everything and remember that a flexible encounter could be, but doesn't have to be, a random encounter. So like I said, to me, random encounter is a misnomer, at least the way I use them, because they're not necessarily random. However, I do want to make a distinction between what I'm going to call a flexible encounter and a story encounter or a location-based encounter. So we've got three types of encounters here. We've got flexible encounters, story encounters, and location-based encounters. So let's define these terms. So a story encounter is one that is directly tied to a storyline of the campaign. This could be main story, side story, whatever. Another way to think about that is a storyline encounter or story encounter is related to a quest that the player characters are exploring. That could be a story quest, or it could be a side quest, or whatever. So a story encounter is just that. It's an encounter that in some way is involved with one of the stories that we're telling in the campaign. Steve says yell in the woods, so it's not random. Yeah, I'll have to talk about that. Yeah, that was pretty funny. So that's a story encounter. A location-based encounter is an encounter that it's just simply an encounter that is tied to a specific location. The encounter happens when the PCs go to that location. So a story encounter might be a location-based encounter. It could be tied to a location, but it doesn't have to be. Story encounter just means it has to do with one of the stories in the game. Location-based encounter means that this encounter is tied to a specific place. So if we're using a map, it's in a specific hex on the map, or if it's a dungeon, it's in a specific room of the dungeon. If you're going to encounter this encounter, you have to go where it is. So, story encounters can be location encounters, but they don't have to be, and vice versa. A flexible encounter is an encounter I can run at various times or places in the story. These can be a flexible encounter could be a random encounter. Either the time and location where the encounter happens is determined randomly, or the nature of the encounter is determined randomly, or both. But a flexible encounter doesn't have to be a random encounter. And I think these are important distinctions to make and understand. So let's talk more about a random encounter. So there's different ways a given encounter could be random. The nature of the encounter could be determined randomly. So, which is to say the encounter is rolled up on an encounter table. So I roll some dice to see what kind of monster or hazard the player characters encounter. For example, I roll between a 23 and 25 on percentile dice, which is an encounter with velociraptors. So that's an encounter where the nature of the encounter is determined randomly. The number of creatures may or may not be also determined randomly. For instance, I could make it random and say they encounter 2d6 velociraptors. Or I could just say they encounter 7 velociraptors. Or they encounter 1 velociraptor per PC, or however I want to do it. So the nature of the encounter could be random. That is to say, what is the thing they're encountering? And the number of those things could or could not be random as well. And, you know, you can combine and contrast all day long. Also, the time when it happens and the location where it happens of the encounter may or may not be determined randomly. This is usually determined with a system like something like every hour you roll a 1d20 on a roll of 18 or higher. The PCs have some kind of an encounter. Now we're going to roll on the Misty Wood encounter table. So rolling 18 or higher on a d20, that's a 15% chance of an encounter every hour. So of course, another way you could do that is you could roll percentile dice and say, if I roll a 15 or lower, then there's an encounter. It doesn't matter. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So, you know, all these things could or could not be random. So we could determine if an encounter occurs and if so, where randomly. We could determine what the encounter is randomly. We could determine how many of whatever it is there are randomly. All this stuff could be random or not, you know, some random, some not, however you want to do it. Now, I want to point out something else here. So I just gave the example of the PCs encounter 2d6 velociraptors, which is to say roll 2 6-sided dice, and that's the number of velociraptors they encounter. So that means 2d6 means they could encounter anything from 2 to 12 velociraptors. Those are the results you can get from rolling 2d6, any number between 2 and 12. Now, I could roll this, right? I could roll 2d6 and see what I get. Or I could pick a number in that range. So I could pick a number between 2 and 12 based on how many PCs are present and how challenging I want the encounter to be. Now, the way I set these up when I make adventures for myself or even adventures for other people to publish is usually the lowest number in the range. So the range for this encounter is 2 to 12 velociraptors. The lowest number in that range, 2 velociraptors, is the easiest encounter that I think would be worth the time to run. So with my group of PCs, I don't think an encounter with 1 velociraptor is even worth our time to run it. 2, maybe. That's the minimum that I think would be worth the time to even deal with. The highest number in that range, so in this case 12 velociraptors, is the most that the PCs can handle if they're all there and they're all at full strength without the encounter being too deadly. So 12 velociraptors is the maximum I think I could throw at this party if everybody's there and everybody's at full strength without it pretty much being guaranteed that I'm going to kill one or more of the player characters. So when I do the number of creatures randomly, I usually set up a range like that, where I roll dice. The lowest number I can get is the least amount of that creature that's worth even messing with. And the highest number I can get is the most of these creatures I can throw at the PCs without being likely to have a TPK or something like that. So that's how I set those up. And as far as how I come up with those numbers, I use a combination of the encounter building system from the Unearthed Arcana as well as the one in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which I did quite a few episodes of Game Master's Journey where I talked about that. But in a nutshell, the encounter system from Unearthed Arcana is much easier to use and to deal with and to get started with. But once you start coming up with what you're going to do, you want to check your numbers with what's in the DMG, because unfortunately the system in the Unearthed Arcana does not factor in action economy, does not factor in that the more opponents there are, it multiplies the difficulty of the encounter. In essence, it does not use the multipliers that we use for there being more than one creature. So you can't just take encounters you make with the Unearthed Arcana and take them to the bank, because if you do, especially if you use encounters with a lot of creatures and you're pushing the limit of what that is saying you can do, you're actually going to be creating deadly encounters that may be well beyond what your player characters can handle. So that's a topic for another day. And again, if you're interested in that, I talked about it quite a bit on the podcast in past episodes. So anyway, let's get back to talking about flexible encounters. I may determine flexible encounters randomly during play, or I may choose one, not random. So, I've got this encounter table, the Misty Wood encounter table that I've created. And I'm going to do one of these behind the screens episodes where I talk about creating that table and how I did it and all that good stuff. But for now, I have this encounter table. So I could determine an encounter randomly by rolling on that table and taking what I roll. Or I could pick something from the table. I could be like, oh, this looks like an interesting encounter. Let's use velociraptors. So those are two ways I could go during play. Like maybe I roll an encounter, right? Like I'm determining whether or not an encounter happens randomly, and I roll 18 or higher on my D20. I'm like, oh, I need an encounter. So I can either roll on the table and get one randomly, or I can choose one. And I'm doing this all on the fly during play. So that's one way I could do it. But what I do more often instead of that is I prepare flexible encounters ahead of time before the session even starts. And then I use them when the time is right. So for this session, for session 1, I planned an encounter with 2d6 velociraptors. And this was going to be this scene 3 encounter. It was going to be the first encounter they have in the Misty Wood after they land and after the birds leave. So this isn't remotely random. I planned for this encounter to happen. But it is a flexible encounter because it's not tied to a specific location. I could do it anywhere that I wanted to in the Misty Wood or even somewhere else. And it's also not directly tied to any particular storyline in the game. So it's a flexible encounter. So for this session, I planned this encounter, 2d6 velociraptors. The purpose of this encounter, so remember, I always have a purpose for everything I do. So the purpose of this encounter is to, again, show that the wilds are dangerous and not to be taken lightly, and to also show that even small and attractive looking creatures can be a threat. So velociraptors are brightly feathered raptors, which are bird-like creatures. They're dinosaurs that are very closely related to modern birds. So these velociraptors, they're about the size of turkeys. And imagine turkeys, only, they're more reptilian underneath the feathers as far as they have mouths with teeth instead of beaks. They have clawed forelimbs. They run on their back 2 legs, just like a chicken or like a Tyrannosaurus Rex. But they're covered in these brightly colored feathers, peacock colors, blue, turquoise, violet, indigo, green, all those colors. So, you see a flock of these things running at you, your first reaction may not be one of fear or something like that. You might be like, oh, wow, look at these pretty birds running at us. And then they get closer and you realize they're not birds at all. So that was part of it, to kind of show that you can't judge a book by its cover always, right? Just because something's beautiful or just because at first glance it doesn't look particularly dangerous, maybe because it's really small, doesn't mean that it's not actually dangerous. I also wanted the player characters to be able to take on something that they should be able to defeat fairly easily as a chance for the players to try out their abilities and begin to learn to work together as a team. Because again, this is the first time these characters have worked together, and it's the first time this particular group of players have worked together. Now, some of these players have played together before, but a lot of them haven't, and they're completely new characters. So it's new for everybody. My goal here, so my purpose with this encounter, is not to present an especially challenging encounter. I just want it to be challenging enough that there is some tension and some sense of danger. But it doesn't have to deplete a bunch of player character resources. I don't have to knock someone to 0 or kill a character or anything like that. Like, that's not the purpose of this encounter. So I decided, I planned this encounter, but I decided that I would determine the number of velociraptors randomly by rolling the 2d6. when I ran the encounter. At the moment that I ran the encounter at the table, I would roll 2d6, and that's how many velociraptors there would be. Why did I decide to do it this way? I don't know. I guess I thought it would be fun. I guess I like to have surprises too as a GM. And I could have easily said, okay, there's one velociraptor per player character, or there's one per player character plus one. So if there's 6 characters, there's 7 velociraptors, which when I select the number of creatures, especially with smaller, like less dangerous creatures like these, that's a lot of times how I will do it. I'll do it as a function of player characters. So there's one of these per player character, or there's 2 of these per player character, or there's one of these monsters per every 2 player characters, something like that. That way, if I have an extra player or a player or 2 don't show up, I can on the fly adjust that because I know that mathematical relationship, right? So if I say there are 6 velociraptors and 2 of the players don't show up and I've only got 4 players, that encounter now is a lot harder than I planned it to be. Where if I say there's 1 velociraptor per player, then and 4 players show up, then there's only 4 velociraptors and it scales, right? But in this particular case, I decided that I would actually roll just for funsies. And what's ironic is I've had a few of these encounters now where it's 2d6 of whatever the thing is. And every time I've rolled a 7, which if you do the math is exactly the average result of 2d6. So if you plot the results you can get from 2d6, you make a nice bell curve. In the center of that curve, the most common result is 7, which is the average of the 2 dice added together, right? Average of d6 is 3.5 times 2 is 7, which is exactly what I rolled. So that's the power of bell curves right there, the power of standard distribution, and why so often in 5th edition, for instance, on encounter tables, we see them rolling multiple dice, so you get a nice bell curve. You can also accomplish the same thing using percentile and what ranges you give to each result, but you have to build that curve yourself, which on the one hand can be useful if you want to do that because you have much more fine control over the odds of each result happening. But if you just want the standard distribution and you don't want to have to spend a lot of time creating it, the easiest way is just to roll multiple dice and get it that way. All right, which I don't know. Maybe I should explain that a little bit more. I don't know how mathy people are. So let's just real quickly let's unpack that just a little bit about what would it be called, a standard distribution versus a linear distribution. Okay, so let's say we're talking about, I'm trying to think of an example here off the top of my head. Well, okay, let's just look at it this way. When you roll a 20-sided die, right, there is a 5% chance for any single number to come up on that roll. So there's a 5% chance you roll a 20. There's a 5% chance you roll a 1, right? And each of those results are equal odds of happening, right? So that's linear. A standard curve, which is the sine curve, on the other hand, for instance, rolling 2d6, you're more likely to roll a total of 7 than you are to roll a total of 2 or 6. And I think the easiest way to understand that conceptually, I mean, you can understand it mathematically by plotting the numbers and seeing, oh, there's more results that add up to 7. But an easy way to understand it conceptually is to think about rolling 2d6 and all the different combinations you can get, right? So to get a result of 2, there's only one way you can get a result of 2, and that's rolling snake eyes. That's rolling a 1 on each of the dice, right? Same thing with a 12. There's only one way to get a 12 on 2d6, and that's rolling 2 6s, boxcars, right? On the other hand, rolling a 7, there's a few different ways you could get a 7. You could roll a 6 and a 1, adds up to 7. You could roll a 5 and a 2, adds up to 7. Or you could roll a 3 and a 4, which also add up to 7. So you see there that you have much greater odds of getting a 7 than you do of getting a 2 or a 12. So if I'm building an encounter table and there's a certain monster I want there to be a higher chance of you getting that monster, I would put that guy on 7. And then the monsters I want to be less likely, I would put on 2 and 12. And it's a curve. So, I mean, 2 to 6 isn't the greatest example. It's nice because it's simple, but it's also a very short range. So the longer the range between your lowest and your highest number, the more curve there is, the more variation and probabilities there are. But it is a curve. So if you imagine a graph, 2 and 6 are down here at the bottom, 7 here is at the top. So your y-axis is how likely is this to happen? And then in between, it's a curve, right? I don't know how much I'm probably just making it more confusing. But anyway, that's what we talk about when we talk about standard distribution, is it makes this standard curve, which correlates with the sine curve. And it just means that numbers in the middle of that range are much more likely to happen than numbers on the outside. And the farther you get from the middle of the range of numbers, the less likely that result is to happen. That's all that means. All right, so I was planning to do this encounter at some point after the PCs landed and the giant Jays had left. And I was planning to do it. So this was a flexible encounter, but I knew exactly when and where I was going to do it. So you could say it was a site-based encounter, but it wasn't really, because the Velociraptors weren't necessarily tied to that one clearing. Because the player characters could have said, we don't want to land at that clearing. We want to land over by that lake or whatever. And if they would have done that, I still would have done the Velociraptor encounter. So it's not really a location-based encounter, even though it might seem like it is. So I knew I wanted to run this encounter. I knew I wanted it to happen after the Jays left, while they were in or near this clearing, relatively soon after they'd gotten in the woods. But exactly when and how that encounter would happen, I didn't determine. I left that up to figure that out in the moment. And so basically what I'm doing as a GM, the player characters land, the birds leave, they're doing whatever they're doing, is I'm just waiting for my moment, right? I'm waiting for that moment where this encounter I want to run with the Velociraptors is going to fit into that moment and make sense and flow and seem like it's something that just happened naturally and wasn't even necessarily something I planned to do. And this is where we can get into what Steve was referencing, talking about yelling in the woods, because without probably knowing it, Steve, the player, handed me the perfect moment to use my encounter. So they land, they're looking around, they're taking stock of their surroundings, and Steve's character, Malagar, is a noble. He's a bard. He's used to be a court bard in the city of Elandria. He's descended from nobility on his father's side. His father is a surface-dwelling dark elf from a dark elf city far away. And so Steve's character is very much the, quote, city boy. And in some great role-playing, Steve had his character shouting into the woods, asking if anyone was out there. Which, as someone who's grown up in the city and doesn't know a thing about surviving in the wilderness, probably makes sense as something to do. It's like Steve's character said, hey, if I'm in the city and I want someone's attention, I just holler at them across the street, right? Why would I do any different here? And it was also a great moment because one of the other players, Phoebe, plays a Furbolg druid who is, the wilderness is her home. And both, Phoebe and her character instantly realized that what Steve's character was doing was a bad idea without me even having to tell her, which was awesome. And this gave me my moment because I was like, oh, great. Now, in addition to all the other purposes of this encounter, I can also use it to show why you don't yell in the woods. And it was a perfect cause and effect, right? A player did something, cause, and then the environment reacted, effect. Steve's character yells in the woods. A flock of velociraptors that are nearby hear the sound and come to investigate. And it was perfect. I couldn't have asked for a better setup for my encounter that I was planning to use at some point somehow anyway. So now I had an obvious reason why the Velociraptors knew the player characters were there and why they attacked them, which is Malagar shouted into the woods. So the way I prepare for game sessions is I use these flexible encounters a lot. And normally I have at least a few of these flexible encounters prepared for any given session. They are flexible encounters, which means they are not tied to a certain place or time. I can use them anywhere that it makes sense to use a given encounter. I can use it at any time I need to. And they can usually be run in any order. Like I don't have to run my flexible encounters in a certain order, although I may sometimes have an ideal order in mind of just the way I think they'll flow. So that's the case for this session. I had something like 6 of these flexible encounters planned, which is way more than I need. way more than I need. We ended up doing 3 scenes, 2 encounters. And so I had 4 more encounters than I needed. But I had 6 ready to go. And I had an idea of how I was going to use some of them. So I knew that the Manicore encounter was going to be first, was going to occur during the flight. I knew that the Velociraptor encounter was going to be second and was going to occur at some point after they landed in the woods and so on. But I could have flipped that order around if I wanted to. It wasn't a huge deal, but a lot of times I kind of have some idea of how I might use these encounters, but it's not set in stone. So sometimes the players will just hand you the perfect moment to use one of your prepared flexible encounters on a silver platter, like what Steve did in this instance. But with a truly flexible encounter, it's usually not hard at all to find good times and places to work them in. So again, I come up with a few encounters that make sense for the area that the player characters will be in, that use monsters that could be in that area. And again, I may get these monsters from a table or however I do it. And, I try with these encounters, I try to have a variety of different monsters, a variety of different challenge levels. Some of them are easier, some of them are harder, things like that. But I try to come up with a handful of varied encounters that could all work in this area that I can use as needed. So these encounters, these flexible encounters, can serve a lot of different purposes in the game. They're great tools for pacing. So, if the players are getting bored, or they're arguing on and on about what to do, or you just feel like the pacing is getting kind of slow and the game's starting to drag and get kind of boring for one or more people at the table, you can spring one of these flexible encounters on them. Just pick the one from your list of encounters that fits this particular situation best. These flexible encounters are also great ways to deplete the player character's resources if that's something you feel you need to do as the GM to soften them up for other encounters that are coming, whether those are more flexible encounters or they're location-based encounters you think the player characters might get to, or some kind of story encounters that you're planning to run. So this fight with the Velociraptors went pretty well for the player characters. Craig's cleric character, Quincy, got knocked to 0 hit points, got knocked unconscious, but was almost immediately healed. I think either the next turn or the turn after, he was healed, like in less than a round. Danielle's character, Fear, the lore master wizard, took a critical hit, which for a second level wizard is a pretty big deal. And was in the danger zone of getting knocked to 0. But the player characters did a really good job of teamwork, of helping each other out. One thing that's interesting about this particular group is everybody in the group is a spellcaster of some kind. In fact, all of the player characters are full spellcasters, which is to say they go all the way up to 9th level spells, except for Brett's character, the Paladin Wall. But even he, as a paladin, has access to spells. And I think every character except the wizard has some form of healing ability. And in this encounter, I was really pleased by what I saw. I saw numerous characters using their healing abilities to bring Steve's cleric who fell back up, to top off PCs that were getting close to zero. And it was really great to see. And it was cool because I think all of them were using Healing Word, which is only a bonus action. So it wasn't like anybody was taking their entire turn to heal someone, but everybody was kind of chipping in to make sure that the group succeeded. And it was really cool to see. And in all my years of running games, I don't know I've ever seen an encounter with that many different characters doing healing and other defensive things to help the group out. It was pretty cool. I've never seen anything quite like it before. So the encounter went really well, I felt like, and the PCs were ultimately victorious. They defeated the Velociraptors, which are called little terrors in this part of the world. But I felt like there was enough risk in the encounter to achieve my goals, and it wasn't just a pushover encounter that, they didn't need to use any strategy or worry or anything like that. There was a little pucker factor there, and I thought it went well, and it accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. So one more thing I'll say about this session. In looking back, I think maybe if you watch this session, you can see what you think. But I think that maybe I should have waited until the next session 2, to run the encounter with the Velociraptors, or even better, done a button or a cliffhanger where I could have begun the encounter with the Velociraptors and then said, okay, we're done. We'll finish this up in the next session. That way we could have had a bit of a cliffhanger, and I felt a little rushed towards the end of the encounter, because I unfortunately have to go to work right after this game, so I can't go over our end time very much at all, or I won't make it to work on time. So I kind of had to end it when I had to end it. And I felt a little rushed towards the end of the encounter. I was kind of pushing the players a little bit to get through it. So looking back, I kind of wish I would have waited till the next session so we could have taken our time with it. But at the time, I thought there'd be enough time. I think we had something like 20, 30 minutes left when I started the encounter. I thought we'd have enough time. But I often underestimate how long a combat will take, especially at the early stages of a campaign, where people are kind of still figuring out what they can do and stuff like that. So yeah, I felt like I was rushing the players a little bit at the end, which wasn't ideal. But other than that, I felt like the encounter went well. Greetings to Justin in the chat. Says he's finally caught up. Awesome. Brett says, your true purpose with the encounter was to give Wall a natural distrust of birds. Yeah, maybe. That might be just icing on the cake. Some benefit I didn't plan for. Steve says he thought I ran it to kill the cleric. Nope. Yeah, I wasn't trying to kill anyone, and definitely wasn't trying to kill anyone specific. But yeah, so that was our first session. And just in addition to what I was, what I've already said, something I've noticed, we've run 3 sessions now, is it seems like we've pretty consistently been getting through 3 scenes or 3 encounters per session, which comes out to about 1 hour, because we play about 3 hours. So that's nice for me to know, planning going forward. I mean, like I said, I had 6 fleshed out flexible encounters in the bag for session 1. And I only used 2 of them. I also had probably 3 or 4 more other ideas for encounters that I hadn't fully fleshed out, but I could have run if I needed to, which I didn't use any of those. So, I consistently over prepare, which is to say I'm prepared to run for far more than what we get through in a given session. Usually it's almost double. I'm usually, what I prepare for one session ends up being enough to get us through 2, sometimes even 3 sessions of play. But none of that time is wasted. I always use it all eventually. So, some of these encounters that I had ready to run for the first session, I used in the second session. And so that meant that when preparing for the second session, I didn't have to prepare encounters. I already had encounters ready, which gave me more time to work on other things like fleshing out NPCs and things like that. So, that's probably going to be a recurring theme in the series about how to do your prep in such a way and how to use your prep in such a way that time that you spend preparing for your game is never wasted, even if you don't use the thing you prepared in the session that you thought you might use it. You can always find a way to use it later. So I think as we go through this campaign and as I talk about the sessions, we'll hopefully have numerous examples of things that I prepare for a given session. For whatever reason, I don't use it. And then later on in the campaign, I find a way to use that thing that I prepared. And I will always try to point that out when it happens, because I think that's one of the most important things that you learn as you gain experience as a GM is how to get the most bang for your buck when it comes to what you put into your preparations for your game sessions that you're running. All right. And I just realized I don't have my digital recorder going. That's okay. That's why we have redundancies. So let's see real quick. Let me check if there's any comments on the videos that I need to respond to. I'm pretty sure there's not. Pretty sure I've already addressed everything, but we will check. Whoops, that's not where I want to go. Let's see. Prelude. Here we go. Helps if you go to the rights. All right. Nope. No comments at all on the first session. And now let's check last behind the screen. I don't think there's anything there. This is they will send you to some. So you hear me talking in the background? Yep. Nope. Okay, we're good. All right. So I think that'll wrap it up for today. Just to let you know what else I've got planned in this series. The next behind the screen, number 5, I'll talk about the preparation I did for the second session. And let's see. Then behind the screen, number 6, I will talk about creating the Misty Wood encounter table. Behind the screen, number 7, I will then talk about session 2 as far as what happened. So number 5 is going to be preparing for session 2. And then number 7 is going to be about running session 2, just like this one was about running session 1. And then behind the screen, number 8 will be discussion of session 3. So that's what we've got planned. And I'm going to get these produced as quickly as possible and get those released as soon as there's no spoilery material on them. So thank you so much for watching. And again, if you have any questions about these behind the screens episodes or the actual game sessions, just post those to the relevant YouTube video and I will refer to those in future episodes. So have a happy Halloween, everyone. And I'll see you again soon.